Today I'm going to be talking about disasters and catastrophes and what the ethical implications are of the context of the 20th and 21st centuries. At the bottom of this slide I have two photographs. One is what the Earth looked like in the year 1950, about 70 years ago, and the one on the right is what the Earth looked like in terms of the amount of space debris that is surrounding the Earth in the year 2020. And I see this transition as a metaphor in many ways for how the world has changed and the implications of it in terms of disasters and ethics. There are four aspects of this problem I would like to look at today. The first one is the aggregation of micro-rationality. The second is complexity and wicked problems. The third is the fact that we are now in a zero-sum game environmentally, and the impact that has on planetary boundaries. And finally, the social contract that we have between government and citizens, how well it's doing. In terms of the aggregation of micro-rationality, I'd like to begin by just looking at this cartoon in the bottom left-hand corner of the slide. So it shows a huge traffic jam with a lot of people sitting in their cars, and they're all thinking the same thing. If those idiots would just take the bus, I could be home by now. So as an individual, it can make a lot of sense. It can be a very rational decision to be driving a car, especially if you're the only one doing it or if there are very few people doing it. But when everybody starts to do it, and that micro-scale rationality becomes aggregated, then you can end up in a situation where it becomes irrational and it works for nobody. So the point is that sometimes what is rational at the microscale aggregates to irrationality in the macroscale. And this is especially true when we're emphasizing the good of the individual as opposed to the common good. And the tragedy of the commons is a good example of this. In the modern day world, we're seeing this in a number of areas. Nuclear weapon proliferation is one, of course, emission of greenhouse gases and climate change and cumulative environmental risks. And all of these are hugely important in terms of the potential impacts it can have on everybody. And they're all subject to this problem of aggregation, where what is rational at the microscale becomes irrational at the macroscale. I'm showing two examples here of the aggregation of rationality. On the top left, it's an example of nuclear warhead stockpiles. And from post-World War II, the 1950s, there was a dramatic increase in nuclear warhead stockpiles. But following that, in the mid-1980s, there was recognition of the irrationality of what was going on in terms of there potentially being mutually assured destruction. And so we saw this recognition leading to a decrease in these sorts of stockpiles. On the right-hand side, we're seeing concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The first chart on the left goes back 800,000 years, and the right-hand side, where the historical range box is, shows from 1950 to the year 2020. And if you look at these, you can see that current greenhouse gas concentrations, specifically carbon dioxide, are by far exceeding the historical range. And this has significant implications in terms of climate change and possibly existential impacts to the kind of civilization we have in the world, certainly existential impacts to many parts of the ecosystem. And again, this is a tragedy of the commons kinds of issue, because rationality in the microscale just aggregates to irrationality in the macro scale. And over the past century or two, we've been seeing massive increases in globalization and economic growth, both of which increases aggregation in our world. And this increase in aggregation for many systems, I suggest, are leading to an irrationality as opposed to the rationality for which they were originally designed. And so they're becoming situations we're embedded in that oppose the values that led to their creation. So what are the ethical implications of this kind of aggregation? Well, because it's a tragedy of the commons kind of issue, where it is the emphasis on individual agents that results in irrationality in the aggregate, The emphasis on morals that look at individualism and libertarianism as highly valued approaches em emphasize this irrational aggregation. And so I'm suggesting that we need a greater emphasis on communitarianism and egalitarianism in terms of the ethical values that we adopt. And because we're in a globalization environment where systems and communities are becoming increasingly important, I believe we need to give much more attention to the ethics of systems, including artificial intelligence, and the ethics of communities. Certainly within academia, we're seeing this trend. On the bottom right-hand side, you can see a graph showing a literature search of the number of articles on artificial intelligence ethics and roboethics from 2005 to 2020. And you can see that it has increased dramatically. And there's even a journal now on ethics and systems, and I have the cover of it in the bottom left-hand side. The degree to which this emphasis is being translated beyond academia into the world and practitioner community is unclear, but I think it's something that is extremely important. So if I'm suggesting that we need a decrease in an emphasis on individualism and an increase in emphasis on communitarianism, one interesting thing to look at would be how those trends have been happening over the past century or so. There is one theory called moral foundations theory, which looks at the moral domain divided into 5 basic categories. One category is harm versus care. A second category is fairness versus cheating. A third is in-group loyalty as opposed to betrayal. The fourth is authoritarianism versus subversion. And the final one is purity or sanctity as opposed to degradation. In research looking at this particular moral domain as a function of self-reported liberal identity, and this is the chart on the left, it shows that there is a significant difference between liberal and conservative political philosophies. So people who tend to be more left-wing, more liberal, will emphasize the harm and fairness parts of the moral domain much more than loyalty, authority, or sanctity or purity. People who are on the political right tend to give more emphasis to the loyalty, authority, purity aspects of the domain, and if they're strongly conservative, all parts of those moral domain are similar. People on the political left or political right sometimes look at the other side as being immoral, but a perspective such as this challenges that and suggests that it's not a question of whether one side is immoral or not, but the degree to which they emphasize different parts of the moral domain. On the right-hand side, this is an interesting piece of research, a chart that looked at the relative frequency of virtuous words in the English language based on a Google Books database. And from that, tried to estimate any trends that might be in the moral domain, the different aspects of the moral domain. If we take a look at harm, for example, which is this red line, you can see that it began sort of in the mid-70s, back in 1900, and showed a gradual decrease over time, with the exception of during World War I and World War II, where harm issues got increasing emphasis. But then the 1980s began to show a significant upsurge. If we look at in-group loyalty, it shows that those values were rather low in the early 1900s and over time have been gradually increasing. Fairness, by contrast, which is a more justice-based approach to ethics, this line has been approximately constant over that time. If we look at authority or authoritarianism, again, it's had ups and downs over time, but you can see it's not showing some of the magnitude of the trends of the others. Purity, in contrast, showed a significant downward trend from the beginning of the 1900s down to the mid-1980s, and then a significant increase. And they also did a search for just morality in general, and it showed, again, this black curve, huge decrease over time until the 1980s when it showed quite an upsurge. One has to be careful interpreting this because I'm sure there are biases in the data, and the data may or may not represent real trends in society in terms of moral perspectives. Just to illustrate that, just in terms of harm, for example, it is well known that there's a gender aspect to how people perceive ethics, and that women place greater emphasis on harm and a lesser emphasis on sort of justice-based approach as compared to men. And I just took a look at gender ratio here, the number of women relative to all faculty members, and how many papers they have published over time. If we take a look at this chart here, you can see that ratio began to change significantly in the late 1970s. And so, for example, you could hypothesize that this increase in harm, for example, is a reflection of the increase of female academics and perhaps women publishing more just generally in the world. So this sort of data does have to be interpreted with caution. There's been some discussion of adding liberty as a sixth moral domain, and liberty is certainly something that was considered extremely important as part of the public debate during COVID. In the US, for example, notions of the importance of liberty go back to their founding, and there's this famous phrase, "Give me liberty or give me death," which Patrick Henry delivered in his speech in the year 1775. And we see this emphasis on liberty and its importance in current times in the United States and in Canada. So, for example, here we have the Alberta Freedom Convoy on the right-hand side, and much of the debate around vaccine mandates and mask mandates was around the notion of freedom. And this brings up hugely important moral tensions in society. Essentially, to what extent should government be paternalistic and make decisions in terms of the population and take away freedoms for the greater good? There are strong arguments that they should do so from a utilitarian perspective. So here we have a graph, for example, of weekly COVID death rates for all ages. This is from the CDC. And it does show that the death rates for unvaccinated people are extremely high relative to those who are vaccinated but don't have a booster. And even those are much higher than those who are fully vaccinated with the booster. So in this debate of libertarianism versus paternalism, it can be argued on consequential grounds, in which case there are strong arguments for paternalism on the part of government. But if you're going to argue it on deontological grounds, just in terms of the rights of people and their freedoms, then you might say, well, people should have the freedom to make their personal choice. But that has implications for others and for the public good in general. The next thing I would like to talk about is complexity and wicked systems. We live in a world where pretty much everything is connected to everything else. And this chart is just one visual illustration of that, of the global risks interconnections. I'm arguing that the world has become more complex and more interconnected in many ways. And because of that, disasters that are morphing, they are changing. And they're changing to the degree that they are derivatives of the context within which they exist. So because to a large degree disasters are socially constructed events and reflect society and the environment, they also are becoming more complex and more interconnected. These global systems are being subjected to a series of massive shocks on the time scale of decades. Population growth, climate change, urbanization, environmental degradation are examples of those. And if you look at it from a systems perspective, in the fact we have a complex adaptive system with chaotic components, what we see is a kind of system that lacks predictability, is dynamically sensitive to small perturbations, exhibits surprising self-organization at times, and is likely to go through transformative changes in the future. One thing we know about these kinds of systems is that they can evolve in unpredictable ways, and the very notion of control can be a myth. We can certainly have influence over how things happen. For example, we can destroy entire ecosystems. But to deterministically determine outcomes in the sense that if we do ABC, we end up with X, Y, Z is really a myth. One aspect of this problem is that disasters are what are called a fat-tailed problem, which means that they have statistical distributions that are fat-tailed. In the top part of this graph, I have an illustration of how people generally see the world, which is through what's called a normal or a bell curve distribution. And when we have statistical distributions like that, we think of things in terms of averages or means or standard deviations. And it makes sense to think of things that way for many, many types of distributions that we're used to working with. But much of the world doesn't look like that at all. For example, on the bottom part, I have a histogram of city populations. And instead of this bell curve kind of distribution, what we see is a very large number of cities with small population, and then a few cities with very large populations. And in fact, those cities with very large populations can dominate the statistics. And these sorts of distributions are common, not just for city populations, but say many hazards have those kinds of distributions, like earthquake magnitudes, for example. And if we look at disaster impact statistics, they tend to follow this fat-tailed distribution. Here's one example of that fat-tailed distribution for disaster impacts. I took this data from the NOAA site of US billion-dollar weather disasters, and on the top half of the chart, you can see the impact of tropical cyclones and hurricanes in the United States from 1980 to 1921 in terms of the number of fatalities. And again, you see the frequency of small events is very large, and then it tends to drop off. And in fact, I had to divide this into two separate charts in terms of fatalities because the first set of data only went up to the 100s, whereas we had two events, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria, where the number of people who died was in the 2,000 or 3,000 people range. And those two events dominate the statistics and in fact account for 72% of the total fatalities in this particular data set. The mean value of 120 is just not a very useful statistic. It doesn't tell you where most of the events occur, and it doesn't tell you what your worst case scenarios are going to be like. It is just not a very useful statistic. On the bottom half, we see, again, with the same data set looking at economic damage. And the tail is not as fat. The difference isn't as extreme, but we still have a fat tail distribution. And in this case, the worst three events account for 37% of the total costs. If you look at the world, well, disasters certainly in terms of a Gaussian or normal distribution, that is going to be a flawed perspective. And a power law way of looking at the world is a very different way of viewing it. And for these sorts of situations, sorts of events, even the very concept of normal is a flawed notion. Words like average, expected value, variance are not useful concepts, and yet they're often used to try and understand disasters or other fat-tailed events. These fat tails exist because of strong underlying dynamics, such as feedback loops, network effects, or self-organization. And just to give an example of that, if we think in feedback loops, one distribution that tends to be fat-tailed is wealth in many parts of the world, especially in North America, for example. And the thing is that wealth can create more wealth. It creates opportunities for people to invest and control the environment and so forth, the economic environment. And because of that, you have a feedback loop where people who are, or institutions who are really, really wealthy have greater opportunities to increase that wealth. And that is one of the dynamics that leads to fat tails. There's one quote here from a recent paper noting that tail risks are becoming increasingly important and common because of a more interconnected and fragile global system. And so this fat tail problem that we have with disasters is something we really need to pay more attention to. So what are the implications that disasters is a fat tail problem? Well, one is ruinous events are much more likely in power law distributions than they are in normal distributions because that tail is fat and require more attention to be paid to them. But at the same time, it's very difficult to determine or calculate the probability of them, and perhaps not even possible. And because of that, the conclusion one must draw is that we need a much greater emphasis on the precautionary principle than has been given in the past. And that we need to think more in terms of risk avoidance as opposed to utility maximization. So a traditional utilitarian approach would be to say, okay, let's try and maximize some good. We'll maybe do a cost-benefit analysis, some risk analysis to see how we can do that. Maybe it would be an optimization problem instead of a maximization problem. That all depends upon the problem being well-defined in the sense that you know probabilities, you know outcomes, you can define them, and you have high confidence levels. And for many of the problems we're seeing today with disasters, we don't have that, and therefore the emphasis on risk avoidance is increasingly important. There is an interesting literature on wicked problems, which is a kind of problem that we're seeing more and more in the world because it's becoming more complex, more chaotic, and more interconnected. There are a number of characteristics associated with wicked problems. For example, not having a definitive formulation. Perhaps not having a stopping rule. It lacks that kind of inherent logic. The solutions are not true or false, but only good or bad or better or worse. Solutions can't be tested, and you cannot use a trial and error approach because processes are irreversible. On the right-hand side, there's a chart here. On the y-axis, we have complexity. On the x-axis, we have how complicated a problem is. And the range goes from what are considered to be tame problems on the bottom left here towards more wicked problems. And when you get into the area of wicked problems, it just requires different approaches. So here are the other characteristics of wicked problems that came from the original paper that was published about them. One is there's no end to the number of solutions or approaches to try and deal with them. Each wicked problem is essentially unique. They can always be described as symptoms of other problems. For example, climate change, yes, it's a problem, but it's also a symptom of a dysfunctional relationship that our human civilization has with nature. Depending on how the problem is framed, it can determine possible solutions. So again, climate change, it can be framed as a technological problem. So we can solve it with technology and engineering that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Or you could frame it as a moral and ethical problem, which would be quite a different approach. And finally, that when you're presenting a solution, you have no right to be wrong because of the potential consequences of that. I did a bit of a literature survey about wicked problems, and I just wanted to share with you some of the comments that were made in the different papers that were published. So one comment is essentially that we have to be both scientist and poet. So this reflects the fact that yes, there are sort of more objectivist aspects to problems that we need to deal with, but it also resides in the area of sort of qualitative research and values and so forth. Traditional ethical analyses that are based upon consequentialism and deontology, so a utilitarian approach or a Kantian approach, are not suited to dealing with wicked problems for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's because there are framing contests. So different groups or stakeholders will frame the problem in different ways based upon their worldview and values. and they often are recast in terms of emotional and value-laden terms, especially when a problem affects the fundamental way that people see how they think the world should be. Wicked issues require complex and iterative solutions, and often lurch from crisis to crisis. And our ability to control these problems is just so difficult because we're dealing with a complex adaptive system that it undermines leaders' attempt to control it. In fact, there may be nobody in control. And though they may have no right answers, they still have lots of wrong answers. And because they're so difficult to understand in terms of probability and consequences, a utilitarian approach is very difficult to do. So again, here we have a moral problem. So you may say there's no right to be wrong, but there's no way to be right. We have competing frames, values, multiple goals. The problem isn't one of optimization. It's not a system that is capable of being optimized. Rule formulation in terms of duties and rights will be strongly contested, so deontological approaches are very difficult. And so again, what I'm suggesting here is that our moral goal needs to shift away from a traditional way of trying to solve problems, a utilitarian or deontological one, just trying to avoid worst possible outcomes, which again is an emphasis on the precautionary principle. The next part of the problem I would like to address is the fact that we are now living in a zero-sum game and planetary boundaries exist. So in a zero-sum game, person A can only win if person B loses. So a game of poker is a good example of that. Environmentally, the human ecological footprint far exceeds what the planet can sustainably support. This is called ecological overshoot. And by some estimates is at least 60% larger than we can support. So here we are in a system where we're engaged in prolonged overshoot, and the outcome for that is inevitable. The inevitable outcomes are undershoot and possibly collapse. To illustrate that, I have a graph here showing the UN Human Development Index on the x-axis as compared to the ecological footprint per person on the y-axis. There are two horizontal lines, one showing the world biocapacity in 1961, and then there's a lower line showing the world's biocapacity in 2014, which is decreased. The box in the bottom right-hand corner that is shaded light blue is the Sustainable Development Quadrant. So what it shows here is where different countries exist in this particular grid. And we can see that there are a lot of low UN Human Development Index countries that are aspiring to growth. And that pathway of growth is shown by other countries that are blue and orange and in different colors. And you can see essentially none of them exist within the Sustainable Development Quadrant. So the system we have in the world in terms of our goals, development goals, which are really based on ethical principles, are ones that are unsustainable in the long run. So where are we at in terms of planetary boundaries? We seem to be on an unsustainable path. So a planetary boundary is a level that is thought that we should not exceed if we're going to be sustainable. And in this particular presentation, this chart on the left-hand side, it shows that in a number of areas we're already exceeding what are considered to be planetary boundaries. In terms of novel entities, in this area here, in terms of climate change, the integrity of the biosphere, land system changes, and biochemical flows. The safe operating space is the green area in the middle, and as the bars become more orangey and ready and move farther away from those safe operating spaces, it's considered to be more dangerous. I'm sure there can be debate and contention over exactly what is considered a safe operating space. For example, climate change, it's going to be a certain number of parts per million of atmospheric concentration, or a particular temperature, average temperature change. And these things can be fuzzy and unclear, but I think this graph still shows that we're in an area which is certainly seeming very dangerous in terms of the impacts of what we're doing to the world on it in many ways. So novel entities is a particularly interesting aspect, and so the authors of this say that they submit that the safe operating space of the planetary boundary for that area is exceeded since the annual production releases of things like different chemicals are increasing at a pace that outstrips global capacity for assessment and monitoring. And we're certainly putting huge amounts of chemicals into the atmosphere, the ocean, the earth, and I just have a couple of quotes there on the bottom right-hand side indicating the degree to which we're having a growth of plastics and chemicals into the atmosphere. So how dangerous is this? Like, does it really matter? And I would say it does matter. And just as an example of that, I'm going to talk about the ozone hole. So chlorofluorocarbons were used for a variety of industrial purposes. And there's a massive emission of them into the atmosphere, in the last century. It was thought these chemicals were inert and would not harm anything, but it turns out that in the presence of ultraviolet radiation on polar stratospheric clouds that are below minus 80 degrees Celsius, it goes through a chemical reaction that is ozone destroying. And these particular chemicals have a half-life in the 50 to 80-year range. You can see a graph there going from the 1950s to 2016 showing the decrease in the ozone levels in the Antarctic, which led to what was called the ozone hole. And we did have the Montreal Protocol, which stabilized that, controlled the number of chlorofluorocarbons going to the atmosphere, so we see this decrease, and now we're in a fairly stable situation. So that's good. When you destroy atmospheric ozone, then ultraviolet radiation increases in terms of getting through the atmosphere to the earth, and that can cause skin cancer and other problems. And so we managed to avoid that bullet. But what if we do a what if game? So were we lucky or were we smart? We did not know this was going to happen. It was a surprise. And in fact, that event was going on for a long period of time, for years before it was really recognized that it was happening. The data was coming in, but the quality control programs, which were automated in the places where it was being received, was thinking the data was bad and was throwing it all out. So what if, instead of happening at temperatures of minus 80, this had happened at temperatures, say, minus 30 degrees Celsius? Then the problem would not have been just restricted to the polar regions, it would have been global, because stratospheric clouds in mid-latitudes and other areas, temperatures minus 30 are common. And suppose instead of a half-life of 50 or 80 years, it had been one of those chemicals that had a half-life for hundreds or even thousands of years. Then we would have been in a global catastrophe. It's not that we were so smart, it's really that we were lucky enough that the situation allowed for intervention, so we didn't achieve global catastrophe. All of these have important implications in terms of environmental ethics, in terms of the precautionary principle, and also in terms of what our duty to future generations is. In terms of environmental ethics, yes, this is something that has received increasing attention both in the academic literature, in the public sphere, but in terms of implementing those ethics, in terms of how our society actually functions, it has not nearly been powerful enough. Again, we need a much greater emphasis on the precautionary principle. We are engaging in a kind of global Russian roulette exercise where outcomes are unpredictable and potentially uncontrollable. And if we think that we have a duty to future generations, there are strong arguments that we're simply failing in those duties. Well, what about the social contract that exists between governments and their citizens? How well are we doing? Solving many of these problems to a large degree will depend upon governmental intervention. In the top chart there, it's a graph which shows how much different populations have trust in their governments, in the federal government. And it varies a great deal by country. So for example, China did very well at 91%, and this particular selection, Argentina did the worst at 22%. In this global survey on the bottom chart, people were asked about their thoughts of government, NGOs, and business communities in terms of how ethical they were and how competent they are. So you can see in terms of ethics, NGOs tended to rate the highest. In terms of competence, business tended to rate the highest, but both of those organizations, you could argue, did not too badly. But in terms of government, and this is a global survey, it's an average, so it would vary a lot by country for sure. But it shows that government is generally considered to be both unethical and incompetent. And so this creates a huge problem in terms of the social contract, because how well it functions is dependent upon the degree of trust that citizens have in their government. One illustration of this is the corruption's perception index. And again, this is a survey where people are asked about how corrupt they thought their societies are, and it ranges in scale from 0 to 100, where 100 is very clean and 0 is highly corrupt. And you can see on the chart, the map on the left, how different countries rated for that. So the Scandinavian countries, for example, rated very well. They had very high scores, and there are many other countries in the world, particularly in South America and Africa and Asia, where the scores were not as good. If you take a look at those country scores and do a histogram of them, you can see that there's a large number of countries where the CPI scores are low, where the perception is that the society is quite corrupt. And even if you just look on average at OECD countries, only about half of the people tend to trust their government. If we look at the United States as one example, and what public trust in government is like, then the graph on the left shows that, broadly speaking, there's been a decrease over time in terms of trust in the government. Back in the 1950s and 60s, it was quite high, exceeding 70%. But if we look at where it is here in 2015, and I think current values are similar to that or even lower, it's down around or even under 20%. So this is a massive loss of trust in terms of government. And this goes along with a corruption perceptions index in the United States that is also showing increases perceptions that there is more corruption in society. These sorts of trends are mirrored in Canada and many other Western countries as well. An interesting discussion is the effect of post-modernity on ethics. So aspects of post-modernity, I think, that are relevant is its notion of a post-truth society, or at least that we all have our own truths, which creates a bit of a logical problem. That if you think the truth is that all truth is relative, then why is that true? It emphasizes ethical relativism, that all ethical systems do not have an absolutist kind of grounding, but it just depends on culture and perspective, and also a rejection of the grand narrative. But if all truths are equal and we can all have our own set of facts, what does this mean in terms of ethical analysis? Creates a huge problem, certainly for consequentialism, which is based on analysis of outcomes. And I think to a large degree, goes down to the difference between belief and knowledge. So one can say there is a duty to have rational beliefs. This could be a deontological kind of approach where, okay, we have our beliefs, but we have a duty to seek unbiased evidence on issues that we take moral positions about, or perhaps any important issue. And if you do not seek that unbiased evidence and incorporate it as best you can into creating a belief system, then you're abrogating your duty. Now, there's some things for which that might be fairly easy to do, especially problems which do not engage your value system. But when you're dealing with wicked problems which do engage your value system and they're complex and they're complicated, then it becomes much more difficult. Because we all have cognitive frames, we all have cognitive conservatism and tend to interpret information and knowledge through our belief systems. Just to illustrate that, there's a chart here where groups of people were asked, how much risk do you believe global warming poses to human health, safety, or prosperity? This is from the Cultural Cognition Lab at Yale University. And my naive, I guess, thought before I saw this was that as a science literary score went up, which means as people had greater levels of scientific literacy, given that the dominance of the science information emphasizes problems associated with climate change, that they would tend to give higher risks. But in fact, that was true for people who had an egalitarian or communitarian worldview. But we have the opposite effect, where people are hierarchical or conservative individuals and have an individual or libertarian kind of view of how society should be organized and what their rights are. And essentially the mechanism that people in this particular group used was they took the greater amount of information they had and cherry-picked information that they used to support their pre-existing worldviews. And so you had a process of rationalization instead of a process of using rational information and arguments to try and come to unbiased decisions. And of course, if we had picked a different kind of question, a different issue, then you would have seen the same sort of thing with the egalitarian communities where increased science literacy might have led to decreased belief, because for all of us, these things engage our worldviews and our values in ways that affect our opinions. So there are ethical implications for this. This loss of trust is a huge problem, and I believe it means that the capacity and ability of governments to solve or manage some of these very difficult problems is becoming seriously diminished. We need to regain trust. As leaders, especially political leaders, need to regain trust. And to do that, they have to be and be perceived to be more virtuous than they have been in the past. Virtuous in the sense of being honest, of being competent, of having compassion and courage and dignity and fairness and honor and integrity and fidelity and so on and so on. The very nature of our political and economic systems can contribute greatly to disaster risk creation. If we take a look at critical infrastructure and public goods, this is a really interesting area. So in countries where there have been neoliberal political economic philosophies that have been powerful, it has resulted in a broad shift of ownership and authority within the private sector. So particularly with respect to critical infrastructure, in North America, about 85% of critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. Now, the primary duties of the private sector are to maximize profit and act in the best interests of the stakeholders. By contrast, the primary duty of government is to serve the public good. And if you argue that critical infrastructure is a public good, and I think there's a strong case to be made for that, then it brings up some serious issues about what the role of government should be with respect to critical infrastructure, both in terms of ownership and oversight. There are many examples of how private sector companies have had poor safety records that have resulted in a disaster occurring. One really interesting book on the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster took a look at Canada's history in terms of privatization and looked at the regulatory frameworks of the federal government and found that in common with other disasters that have happened. There were vague or non-existent regulations, inadequate oversight and/or enforcement, and a weak regulator captured by an industry that is given wide scope to regulate itself. It's kind of like the fox being in charge of the hen house. So privatization, that process, which implements neoliberal philosophies, certainly serves goals related to individualistic and libertarian philosophies, and actors that are powerful and elite can certainly benefit from them, but in terms of the social processes that create disaster risk, I would argue that it is a process that increases that. I think as a society, we need to carefully look at the roles of government and the private sector as they relate to critical infrastructure and public goods, and how those affect disaster risk creation. I think that recent trends have resulted in greater disaster risk and many disasters because of that, and that it has been in the wrong direction, and that we need to have government playing a greater role in terms of critical infrastructure. So we can talk about how people ought to act. This is called normative ethics. What should they do? And we can also take a look at how people and organizations actually act, which is called descriptive ethics. And it's important to consider ethical situations from both perspectives. If you take a look at studies of situational ethics, which is the situations people actually find themselves in and how that affects their decision-making, their ethical decision-making, the evidence is that the situational dominates the dispositional. So depending on the situation you find yourself in, those pushes or pulls are going to dominate your ethical decision-making. Organizations and the ethical and moral stance that they take is incredibly important in terms of how we manage risks in society. And there are three aspects of organizations and how it affects ethics that I think are particularly interesting. One is organization size, which is that as the size of organizations increases, individual ethical beliefs and decision-making behaviors decrease. Similarly, in terms of organization level, as individual employees rise to higher levels in an organization, their ethical beliefs and decision-making behavior tends to decrease. And finally, people's ethical beliefs and decision-making behavior tend to become increasingly congruent with top management's beliefs. There tends to be conformity. So there's this push that people who work in larger organizations are generally subjected to situational forces that decrease moral behavior. And yet in this globalizing world, which is becoming more interconnected, many organizations are increasing in size. And so I think this issue of situational ethics is a structural problem that we face in society in terms of dealing with ethical problems. And emphasizes, for example, the need for leaders paying a lot of attention to ethical and moral issues. In fact, to hiring moral leadership and having professional codes of ethics and codes of conduct, both for individuals and organizations, and to creating cultures that supports the implementation and enforcement of those codes of ethics and codes of conduct. So for my concluding thoughts, I think there are a number of factors in the world today that are creating an ethical deficit. One is that aggregation of irrationality. The second is complexity and wicked problems. The third is potential for that we are exceeding planetary boundaries, and that there are social contract failures occurring, especially in terms of the level of trust we have in those who govern us. And finally, the situational ethics makes it difficult for organizations to engage with the kind of ethical and moral frameworks that are needed. And all these are creating a kind of perfect storm, which creates an ethical deficit in society. As a society, we have so much more knowledge than we used to have. in so many areas. And knowledge gives us power, but it's how we use that power that is really important. And ethics can reveal to us how we can use this knowledge and power. And this knowledge and power has been growing much faster than the moral and ethical ability of society to manage it. And so this kind of deficit or gap between power and ethics, I think, is the one that's critical to us in terms of managing disasters and catastrophes in our modern context.